It's just after midnight, early on the morning of August 8, 1975, in China's Henan province. For 3 days, a typhoon that made landfall on the coast days earlier has stalled almost directly overhead instead of weakening and moving on. In that time, some measuring stations record more rain than the region would normally see in a year. Upstream, a dam completed some 20 years earlier, one built, engineers were told at the time, to survive a flood that would only come once in 1,000 years, is holding back more water than anyone who designed it ever planned for. Then, in the dark, it lets go. Not a slow overtopping. A wall of water tears through the earthen dam and drops into the valley below, moving faster than the villages in its path have any chance to hear about, let alone escape. Entire communities that had stood for generations are gone within minutes. Downstream, the surge doesn't stop at one dam. Reservoir after reservoir along the same river system gives way in the hours that follow. A chain of collapses that by the time the water finally spreads out and slows, will total somewhere in the dozens. Nobody downstream had any real warning before the water arrived. By the time it's over, this single night of dam failures will be responsible for one of the highest death tolls of any structural failure in recorded history, and the world outside China would not learn the true scale of what happened here for years to come. Rewind 25 years. In 1950 and 1951, the Huai River Basin suffers catastrophic flooding that kills hundreds of people. A toll of 489 is commonly cited, and leaves millions displaced or affected. China's government, still new, makes controlling this river system a national priority, and a wave of dam construction begins across the basin within just a few years. Among the dozens of dams built in that push is one on the Ru River, a tributary in Henan province, Banqiao. Construction finishes in 1952 under the direct guidance of Soviet engineering advisors, whose designs and specifications shaped the dam from the outset. It earns a nickname from the people who build it, the Iron Dam. Unbreakable, the story goes. But one of the hydrology engineers reviewing the design doesn't accept that. He argues the dam needs far more sluice gates, more places to let floodwater safely out the far side under controlled conditions, than the final design allows for. He's overruled. More gates cost more steel and more time, at a moment when the country doesn't have much of either to spare. The dam gets built to the schedule the moment demands, not to the margin the engineer says the river will eventually demand back. He doesn't just lose that argument once. In 1959, during the political campaign that followed the Great Leap Forward's Lushan conference and branded outspoken technical experts as disloyal, he's publicly labeled a right opportunist and removed from his position entirely. His warning about the dam doesn't get disproven. It gets buried, along with the career of the man who made it. For the next 2 decades, the Iron Dam holds, which, if you weren't looking closely, made it easy to believe the warning was wrong all along. By the early 1970s, Banqiao and dozens of dams like it across the Huai Basin have become simply part of the landscape. Infrastructure nobody thinks much about, doing its quiet job for 20 years running. Then, in early August 1975, around the 3rd and 4th, a typhoon named Henan makes landfall on China's southeastern coast. Ordinarily, a storm like this weakens quickly once it moves inland. This one doesn't. A collision with a cold air mass moving down from the north, combined with the storm's own slow, stalled motion, pins it almost directly above the Ru River watershed for the better part of 3 days. What falls in those 3 days is a rainfall event some meteorologists still cite as among the most extreme ever measured on land, far beyond the 1-in-1,000-year standard the dam had actually been designed to withstand, and by later academic estimates using this very storm as a benchmark, approaching the theoretical maximum precipitation the region could ever produce. Here's the part worth sitting with. The floodgates at Banqiao, the same additional capacity the dissenting engineer had asked for 20 years before, become clogged with silt as the water rises, and simply can't pass water out fast enough to keep up with what's pouring in from upstream. The reservoirs operators can see the water climbing past every safe mark they have. But in this system, opening the gates wide enough to seriously relieve the pressure requires authorization from an office above them, and the phone and telegraph lines needed to reach that office are already down, cut by the storm itself. Nobody with the authority to act can be reached. Nobody without it is willing to make the call alone. Upstream of Banqiao, a smaller reservoir fails first, sending an extra surge of water down into a dam that is already past every level its designers planned for. Banqiao's water keeps climbing. Around 1 o'clock in the morning on August 8th, it finally crests over the top of the dam itself, and the earthen structure gives way. What happens next is not one dam failing. It's a chain reaction. The wave from Banqiao's collapse slams into the next reservoir downstream, which fails in turn, and then the next, and the next. By the time the flood finally reaches flatter ground and spreads out, dozens of dams across the wider river system have failed in a single night. By the time the water stops moving, the flooded area is enormous, an expanse of countryside roughly the size of a small country. And the death toll from this single event has never been settled. China's official figure is 26,000, but that number wasn't released at the time. The disaster was treated as a state secret, and casualty records weren't declassified until 2005. The figure that actually existed in 1975 was internal and higher. Within weeks, an internal Communist Party assessment in Henan put the dead at roughly 85,600. Later estimates that also count the famine and disease that followed, in a region whose crops, roads, and clean water were all destroyed at once, run higher still. In the 1980s, 8 Chinese water conservancy specialists put the total at 230,000, a figure Human Rights Watch carried to Western readers in 1995, and a 2005 television documentary rounded to 240,000. No source claims certainty on the exact number, and none now can. The records that would settle it were suppressed for 30 years. What isn't in dispute is the scale relative to everything else. By any of these counts, this is the deadliest dam failure in recorded history. It's tempting to file this one under natural disaster and leave it there, an unprecedented storm, worse than any engineer could reasonably have planned for. That is not the whole record, and it doesn't hold up against it either. The dam's floodgate capacity was reduced during design, over the direct objection of the engineer who said it wasn't enough. And on the one night in over 20 years it actually mattered, it wasn't enough. That decision, building fast and to a fixed political timeline, instead of to the engineer's own stated margin of safety, sits with Henan's provincial water conservancy authorities of the early 1950s, not with the storm that arrived 23 years later. The chain of command failure on the night itself is also a decision someone made, long before the storm arrived. A system where a reservoir operator watching the water climb past every safe mark could not open the gates further without reaching an office that the storm had already cut off. That structure was built on purpose, not by accident, sometime before August 1975. And for years afterward, the scale of the disaster went largely unreported outside China, which meant engineers and dam operators elsewhere in the world went without the chance to learn from it as soon as they might have. As for the engineer who said this would happen, the record indicates he lived long enough to be vindicated by it. In the years after the disaster, China held a nationwide dam safety review and tightened its approach to reservoir design in the years that followed. And the principle he had argued for in the early 1950s, that a dam needs more spare capacity than the worst flood anyone can currently imagine, carried more weight going forward than it had in his own time. The people who died in the villages and towns below these dams that night were farmers, factory workers, and entire families asleep in the path of a wave they never saw coming and were never warned about. They are remembered here by the scale of what was lost, not by name. Just after midnight, August 8, 1975. A dam built to survive a flood nobody thought could happen meets a flood that happens anyway, and the extra gates that might have relieved the pressure were never built, because building them cost more than anyone in charge was willing to spend 20 years earlier. It wasn't only the typhoon. It was a warning overruled 2 decades before the water ever rose. A chain of command that couldn't move fast enough on the one-night speed was all that mattered, and the silence afterward that outlasted the dam itself. Banqiao was eventually rebuilt, this time with the floodgate capacity the engineer had wanted the first time. The lesson arrived. It just arrived about 20 years, and by some estimates well over 100,000 lives too late. Structural failure tells one collapse at a time, from the record, and the engineering behind it. Subscribe for the next one.